needed to know what was wrong. I had to find out what it was. And
the first thing I wanted to have is no toxic cleaning products.
Just because you have brain change doesn't mean you can't still do things. You may do it differently. You might need more time.
I decided to turn my disability into my ability, and around 7th and 8th grade, I started playing able-bodied sports.
If we were knowledgeable, if we were educated, we would have saw the signs earlier. Now
you battle for every single inch of help.
Like, for example, if James's head is bothering him, he has peppermint essential oil with a roller top on it, and he knows to roll his head, but he has to be prompted and reminded.
A New Perspective, hosted by Tim Sutton. Brought to you by A Better Understanding, bringing you a better understanding and a new perspective on disabilities.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Sutton, bringing you a new perspective. I hope everybody's having a good week. And what I wanted to do this week, we're going to call this a New Perspective Plus. I don't have a guest tonight, it's just me. And it's geared towards educating people. And some things have happened here in Virginia that really prompted me to want to do this. If you haven't seen the show, I am a retired law enforcement officer, 33 years. And in about 20 or so of those years, I did a lot of work with people with disabilities, specifically Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, other intellectual disabilities. But what I wanted to do is use this platform today, this opportunity to educate you and apprise you of some things that are about to happen. Back on, I believe, Monday of this week, yesterday, we found out that the state has actually mandated law enforcement receive autism training. I've been pushing for this, and it has gone into effect here in Virginia. So all the wheels are turning. I think this is huge. There's a lady with the University of Virginia. Her name is Rose Neville. She's the director of Autism Research Corps, who kind of promoted this thing and got the ball rolling. And I was lucky to be a part of that. We're going to have her next week. We're going to have her on to talk about everything that the new bill entails. But what I wanted to try to do is give you an education on why it's important, why it's imperative for public safety officers in general. Law enforcement, they're the ones who have the weapons and the tools that end up hurting and in some cases killing people. And what has always bothered me through my career is having an officer end up misinterpreting a behavior, a lot to do with autism, because autism is an invisible disability. If there are no other telltale signs, the individual looks just like anybody who's neurotypical. And it's very easy for an officer to misinterpret a behavior as threatening, do what they were trained to do. But the fact is, you don't know what you don't know if you've never been trained on autism and you're not able to pick up on some of the behaviors to tip you off that it's autism. Bad things can happen. So what I try to do is get out there and educate and inform officers of autism, try to advocate for the families. And that's part of what everything I do. So I want to give you a better understanding of some of the things you see with autism. If you don't have a family member, some of this may be brand new to you. But this is why we need in the law enforcement community to have this training. The first slide I'd like to show you is kind of explains autism itself and the three areas that are affected with autism. Number one, your social skills, being able to interact, carry on conversation. A lot of times with autism, you see people who they don't really have any interest in interacting with others. You may have a child on the playground who goes sits in that corner and just digs in the dirt. But you've got the social interaction, you've got communication issues. Some people with autism can communicate fine, some, and I think there's close to about 40% that are non-speaking. American Sign Language is huge with autism, but the fact is everybody has something to say. It's up to you to figure out how they say it. And as a police officer out on the road, if I run across somebody who's not speaking, I've got to overcome that communication gap. And it's not something that they're going to be able to adapt to you. You may have to pull your computer out of the car. They could probably type you a whole story. But the communication issue and also the behavioral issues. Sometimes you see the stemming, which somebody may have a stimming issue where when they get stressed, they'll start to flap their hands or get on their tiptoes, spin in circles, put their hands over their head or over their ears and hum. These are things that officers need to be able to pick up on to help them better do their job. And if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Some may have good social skills, bad communication challenges. The behavior may not be too bad. It's just a little bit of stimming. Others may, everything's weighted differently. So you never know what you're going to get, because if you have met one, you've met one. And being an invisible disability, if I'm, interacting with an adult with autism and there are no telltale signs, hopefully my trainings and other officers that are out there training officers, we could give you something that maybe you'd be able to pick up on something that will kind of lead you to believe this may be autism. Never jeopardize your safety. That's one thing with officers, but we need a better understanding. The next slide will show you another reason why it's so important. Here in Virginia, if you have a disability, you can actually go to public schools from the age 2 to 22. Now, if you look at this slide, in 1998, here in the state of Virginia, in Virginia public schools, there were about 1,500 documented cases of autism in public schools. And right now, with autism being 1 in every 36 births, according to the CDC, you can see in 2021, these are the numbers, over 24,000 students in the Virginia public schools on the autism spectrum. Now, they can go to school till they're 22. What happens when they get out of school, when they're done with high school? Where do they go? What resources are there out there? And I know this is a concern for so many families, but when you have an individual with autism who doesn't necessarily need somebody with them all the time, no aid, or doesn't have to have a caregiver with them all the time, they still may exhibit some of those behaviors, the stemming, flapping their hands, that officers are going to end up responding on calls for service where they may be in a convenience store, overstimulated for some reason, and they get called in as a suspicious person in that store, and that officer is going to have to respond. And if an officer knows something about autism or can walk in and understand some of the behaviors and pick up on some of those, then hopefully they can do their jobs more effectively. That's the goal. Officers always revert back to their training, whatever training they've had. But if they have not had training on autism, they will revert back to their training, but it may cause for an unfortunate situation. And my goal is to educate officers, educate people, so we have these peaceful interactions with positive outcomes. So after the age of 22, they're out in the public, they're driving. I know some people a few years ago helped get another bill passed through General Assembly where the media was surprised when they found out that people with autism drive. And the fact is, people are on the roads with autism. Most of them are very good drivers because they're rule followers and they will adhere to the law. They're in businesses. When you're visiting businesses day to day, you're interacting with people with autism. You may have a clerk that really doesn't want to have much of a conversation. You're trying to strike up a conversation, but they're there to do their job. And again, I told you about the social challenges, and some of these slides that I'm showing you are part of the class that I teach when I travel around the country training law enforcement. But it is very important. And again, I said the statistics right now, according to the CDC, is 1 in 36 births is resulting in autism, and it's 4 times more likely in males. So we need to understand all of this that's going on. Now, the next slide will show you a few of the behaviors you may see with autism spectrum disorders when you're out there interacting with the public. I know from my 23 years working with families and going in and visit with them, dealing with the elopement issue where they wander off and get lost. Yeah, I had a team, we were trained to actually go find them. But the ritual or compulsive activities, when you see a child constantly stacking things or lining their toys up, they thrive on the routine and structure. If Thursday night is pizza night, then every Thursday night is pizza night, and it better be the same pizza that they're expecting, or they may very well spit it out. But they need that routine and structure. And if you think about a law enforcement officer response, It's usually not a routine thing when the officer shows up. And that's why I love the fact that some officers, some agencies actually get out there and go out and do the meet and greets and meet people with disabilities, because those individuals with autism actually get to become familiar with that officer. And many families don't want to call the police when they have a child or even adults on the spectrum with a meltdown, because they look at law enforcement as, I don't want that police car in my driveway. I don't want two. I don't want three police cars in my driveway, because the neighbors will see it. And the perception a lot of times is that law enforcement, when they show up, they usually leave with somebody, or in these parents' cases, a lot of times they're worried that Child Protective Services will get a call and they're going to be told they're a terrible parent, when in fact that's not the case. So I think it's important those officers to understand when that family ends up calling 911 for help, they are in a crisis situation. They don't want to call the police, but to break that wall down where families feel comfortable with the officers responding, and knowing that those officers have been trained on autism, it's got to be a huge relief for a lot of those families. Back to the slide, that same slide, some of the other behaviors that you may ultimately see are the non-compliance. Officers tell them to do one thing, they really don't understand what they're supposed to do. They're very literal. And one thing law enforcement try to get away from is from the word freeze. When you yell somebody to freeze, they're supposed to put their hands up. But understanding those commands that officers may give them, you may see a lot of it as non-compliance. Also, eye contact, a lack of eye contact with many people with autism. Their eyes are constantly moving, and I think a lot of times they are they're absorbing everything else around them. They know you're there, they hear what you're saying, but they don't typically, a lot of them will not give you eye contact. And in law enforcement, we are taught if somebody does not look you in the eye when they're answering your questions, then the tendency is to believe that they're being deceptive. Another issue that you find a lot with autism is the lack of fear. Many of them don't understand that if I do this, this will happen. If I walk into a pond and I don't know how to swim, I will drown. If I walk out into traffic, I will get hit by a vehicle. So that cause and effect thing is challenged. And many times you find with the elopement issue, when they get away from the caregivers, they will take off into situations where they're quite dangerous, but they don't really perceive that fear. We had one of the largest searches here in Virginia in 2011 in my county where I work, but we had a 9-year-old boy with autism who was not speaking, got away from his father in a state park. It's an old Civil War park with trenches, cliffs, and things. And he seemed to see something that he wanted, and he just took off and vanished and was gone for 5.5 days. Like I said, it was one of the largest searches here in Virginia. On the 5.5 days later, we found him alive. He had a couple scrapes and bruises and all, but overall, he was fine. And we had searchers coming in saying that they had seen bear and coyote and foxes, and they were worried that something had happened. And my personal opinion was he was probably okay, because when you look at a lot of the animal attacks and things like that, usually animals respond to that sense of fear. But I think he was out there just playing hide and seek from us, 6,000 people out there looking for him. And I think he did just fine. And luckily we found him safe and he was okay. So it's important to understand these behaviors. And another aspect of understanding these behaviors is autism is not a mental disorder. There are people who have autism who have mental health disorders. But as I've explained to a lot of people, that our mental health system is just busy. And so many people are in crisis. When officers without any type of training on autism, officers will typically get to a scene, and I know from experience, and start to evaluate the scene. Let's say you've got somebody 2:00 in the morning standing on the side of the road with their hands on their ears, humming, and they've been called in as being suspicious. And you walk up and try to carry on a conversation, and you're like, this person could ultimately be in danger. They could be a threat to themselves, or they could be a threat to others. But understanding autism and having some of these tools that I try to give officers, they can hopefully determine, okay, we're dealing with autism. We're not dealing with a mental health disorder. Let me travel down this road, try to find that caregiver, family member, or somebody to get them here. Because typically without them understanding autism, the go-to is to call a mental health worker. Well, if officers could understand more about autism and educate themselves, then they could understand, okay, there's really no need to get mental health involved. Let's take this path to call that caregiver, call that family member, and get that individual to safety and make sure they're safe. And then mental health workers can stay focused on the things that they really need to address. We don't have to pull them away, tie them up with something else. It allows them the opportunity to do their job and do their job better. So that's another reason. Here in Virginia, we actually had a law passed, JP's law, back in 2013. I was able to help with, where individuals on the spectrum or with intellectual disability, on the back of their driver's license or on the back of their DMV issued ID, DMV would place an ASD/ID. Let's cut to a commercial break.
Proton, privacy by default.
And back to the other behaviors, there are numerous ones. I'm just highlighting a few. But another is self-injurious behaviors. I've run across many individuals on the spectrum who are hyposensitive. They can't feel things. You can get either hypersensitive or hypo. Hyper would mean somebody who cannot handle being touched. And I've run across people that if you put your hand on their skin, just even very lightly, it feels like razor blades are cutting through their skin. Anybody's going to react to that. Anybody's going to fight to try to get away from that. And it could easily be interpreted as assault on law enforcement, resisting arrest, and things like that. There are also people who are hyposensitive. The young man that went missing, the 9-year-old in 2011, he was hyposensitive. He could probably have cuts all over his body and not necessarily feel the pain, but he was in need of medical attention. So you don't really know what you're going to get. And I've seen some who were hyposensitive who just wanted to feel something. And I've seen them actually take their head and beat their heads against the wall just to feel something. And some of them, the family, the parents have to end up putting helmets on them because they will have these self-injurious behaviors. Now, as an officer, not understanding anything about that, coming up to somebody that is hurting themselves, they're going to revert back to their training and try to take that person into custody. You can't allow them to keep hurting themselves, but it's going to be a struggle. And it's something that you can see. And again, I've seen people who could only wear certain types of clothes because the clothes hurt their skin. If you see a lot of the t-shirt companies out there now, and they talk about tagless t-shirts, they don't have the tag in the collar. A lot of them are silk screened in. That's one of the reasons that a lot of shirt companies went to that, because those tags can just be so irritating to somebody on the spectrum, and they just can't handle wearing those shirts, and they will have meltdowns because that tag ends up hurting their skin and makes them lash out, makes them have a meltdown. So again, that's why it's important to officers to understand, especially before you put your hands on somebody with autism. You don't know what you're going to get. Like I said, there are 3 areas of challenges, and every single person is different. Just because you were able to interact and get along with this person with autism, you may use the same techniques for a second person, and everything starts to get south, and it ends up being a very bad, unfortunate situation. And the way the memory is a lot of times with autism, they're extremely intelligent, and the memory is absolutely amazing. So that one encounter with somebody with autism, if it's an unfortunate situation and it was a terrible outcome, that individual is probably going to remember that incident, and it's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. And anytime an officer tries to interact with them, it's going to be a struggle. And again, that's why I try to promote these peaceful interactions for positive outcomes. They need to know where they're friends. They need to become familiar with the uniform. I also believe that parents need to teach their individuals, their loved ones with autism, how to interact with law enforcement. Don't walk up and invade our personal space. They will do that. So I would encourage officers to try not to invade that person's personal space. Tell the families to tell the individual, teach the individual, don't go up and start touching things on that officer's belt. Again, it's an invisible disability. When somebody does not look like they're any different than anybody else, and they come up and start grabbing things on your duty belt, such as your weapon, then it could cause for a bad situation. And where this came to light for me was the first young man I met with autism, 6 years old, non-speaking, but the first thing he did when he saw me was walk up and put his hand on my weapon. And between me and his parents, we were trying to teach him, don't put your hand on, don't touch it. Then he would come up and he would lean against the weapon, and we're trying to teach him not to. Then I was sitting with mom and dad at the kitchen table, and I felt something under my chair, and he was laying on the floor and he had his finger at the barrel of my weapon. So in my mind, thinking Matthew didn't look any different than any other child. What happens 20 years from now, 25 years from now, if he's out on his own, sees me standing in a convenience store and runs over and puts his hand on my weapon? You know, my first thought is I'm being assaulted. Somebody's trying to take my weapon. And if I grab hold of him and he's hypersensitive and it feels like razor blades are cutting through his skin, then he's going to react. Like I said, anybody would. And the fight is on because I'm interpreting it as he's assaulting me. And I've got to take this person into custody. And it's going to be a knockdown drag out. The individuals on the spectrum are very strong. Doesn't matter how big or small they are strong and they can fight. And it would have been nice, you know, one thing I stressed to officers is, you know, we put people in handcuffs and they're sitting face down. Let's assume Matthew's laying on his face, handcuffed, and I'm waiting for backup to get there. And I'm sitting there breathing hard, trying to catch my breath. It would have been nice if somebody had told me that with autism and a lot of your disabilities, they're hypotonic. The muscles are not fully developed, and specifically in the chest area. So with the chest being underdeveloped potentially, I'm trying to catch my breath, but that individual, Matthew, is not able to breathe, and he dies from positional asphyxiation just because the weight of his body was keeping him from breathing. I don't want that to happen to anybody. I don't want any officer to have to deal with that. I've had a long career in law enforcement, and I always thought if somebody was trying to take my life or take somebody else's, I think I could pull the trigger, or I could do what I had to do to stop that situation. But to ultimately find out that that individual was not trying to hurt me, that's something I've got to live with for the rest of my life. And I do not want any officer to ever have to deal with that, nor do I want any parent or family members of somebody with autism to have to live through that. That it's not necessary. And my teaching is not going to stop all these occurrences. I'm aware of that. But if I could get out there and educate as many people as possible, and many officers as possible, just to decrease the number of these situations. And I talk about how strong individuals on the spectrum are. There's part of the brain called the amygdala. It's right in front of the hippocampus. And that is what controls your fight, flight, or freeze. When you get startled, if you're sitting there now and all of a sudden feel a spider on your neck, you're going to do one of the three things. You're going to fight to try to get away from it, or to try to kill it. Or you're going to flight, you're going to take off and just try to get as far away from that spider as possible. Or you're going to freeze because you just don't know what to do. You're so startled. Well, in autism, many times that amygdala is enlarged. And that's why if there's a change in routine, something doesn't go as expected, that person with autism a lot of times will have a catastrophic reaction to that change. And you think about schools, you know, a substitute teacher is not routine. So that may be a difficult day or two for that student and the family when they get home. Think about snow days when the routine is getting up, going to school, and you've got to stay home. That can be a very difficult thing for the families. And it may ultimately result in a call to 911 for help. And just remember that is a crisis. That is absolutely a crisis. So the next slide, I talked about the amygdala, right there in front of the hippocampus. But yeah, just keep in mind that can be larger. There are documented cases of it being quite larger. So that response when they're scared, and that doesn't have the same thing as the fear, no fear, understanding cause and effect. This is when all of a sudden something happens. Everything's peaceful and quiet, and all of a sudden that siren blares on that police car. That could cause them to react, and that reaction will be catastrophic, and they will be having a meltdown, trying to get away from that noise, covering their ears. So it's just things we need to make sure that we're aware of. The next slide, I want to show you, I can explain it. It'll mean a whole lot more, but with autism, I think they are so more in tune to the surroundings. All of their senses are challenged, but some of them might be heightened. If you're sitting perfectly quiet in a room, and it's nice and peaceful, you might not pick up on the air coming through the air conditioned ducts. And if their auditory processing issues involved, that noise can be 50 times louder to them, where they can't hear anything going on. They can't hear that teacher talking or understand what's going on, but all they can hear is the sound of that air rushing through. And even in a room, if it's perfectly quiet with fluorescent lights, if it's really quiet, you can actually hear a little hum coming off of those fluorescent lights. That can be so intensified for somebody with autism that they can't hear anything else, pay attention to anything else. They're just being inundated by that noise. Flashing lights, things like that. There are a lot of people with autism who have seizures, and that can easily be spawned with the flashing lights, whether it's fire, EMS, or law enforcement responding. So some of these things that I believe people with autism are picking up on, just going by and going past people who are neurotypical. The brains are not differently wired, where we don't pick up on this or pick up on that. So with autism, it's kind of like this tree, in the springtime, as it is now, when you've got flowers blooming, you've got the trees where the foliage is coming back. We can sit in nature and we can look at all of those things and see the beauty all around us. But in fact, what is causing all of that beauty to happen, besides the sun, is what's down below, and it's the things we can't see. It's those roots. So those roots are making all of that beauty happen. So with somebody with autism or some of your other disabilities, there may be something out there you're not in tune with, or you realize has changed the environment, something you can't see, but they're picking up on. And that's why those leaves, the pretty trees, are the behaviors that they're displaying. It's not always that behavior they're choosing to display. A lot of times it's just the fact that they're overstimulated. And the stemming I talked about, the flapping of the hands, the humming, it's a way for them to drown out whatever is just inundating their person, inundating their brain, and they're trying to cope. So an officer walks up and talks to somebody, an adult that's standing there flapping his hands. If they're understanding autism, the way I've tried to teach it, if it's not a dangerous situation, let them keep flapping their hands. They're coping with the stressor. It will make that encounter, that interaction, more peaceful and more positive. Obviously, if they've got a knife in their hand or something dangerous, then yeah, you need to neutralize that as best as possible. But constantly tell that person, stand there, put your hands down to your side, keep them to your side, don't shake them, stay still. That's going to stress that person out even more, which will potentially lead to more of a meltdown. So it's understanding some of the behaviors. And again, you don't know what you don't know. If you haven't been taught, you're not going to know. You will revert back to the training, but I want to make autism training one of those little extras that when you see the situation, you revert back to that training. I don't want any officers getting hurt, and officer safety is number one. At the end of the night, I would always say, I'm going home. Hopefully everybody around me is going home. But so I don't want officers to jeopardize their safety, but just to understand how scary it is for a parent, a loved one of somebody with autism, worrying about things like this happening. So as I said at the beginning, we were able to get the bill passed here in Virginia to mandate training for law enforcement. I'd like to see it go all the way into corrections, all through the whole criminal justice system. That would be my hope, but you got to start somewhere. It's like climbing a ladder. So I believe right now, as I researched today, I think Virginia will be the 12th state in the United States that mandates training. I'd love to see it across the country, across the world, just to help these special populations deal with what they're dealing with and keep them safe. So I'm hoping next show, I'm looking forward to having Rose Neville from UVA. She's the one that got the ball rolling with getting this bill passed through the General Assembly and made law here in Virginia. But we're going to talk about the training that's going to be developed, help officers understand more what's going on with autism, and we can protect our some of our most wonderful people. And again, I've said it numerous times before, when I was sworn in as a police officer, I was not sworn in to protect a particular group. I was sworn to protect and serve all populations. And sometimes you just need a little education to understand various populations. So again, I'm Tim Sutton. This is a New Perspective Plus today. So I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight and watching the show. And please pass on the information. And I appreciate everybody being here. And Dad, I love you. Thanks for watching.